hour just on the appreciating value of that home. And we're just talking about appreciating value of existing homes. And so today, only 1 in 5 residents can afford the median cost of housing. And I really subscribe to like the housing theory of everything, which puts housing at the center of every single crisis we face in Hawaii, from outmigration to homelessness, as you all know, but also to many of our social issues, right? If you're working 3 jobs just to stay in your house, that's causing a lot of issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I really feel strongly that we need to do sort of like an all of the above approach to solve the housing crisis. A root cause of the reason that housing prices continue to appreciate so rapidly on existing homes is that we are not building a whole lot of homes in Hawaii. The Hawaii Housing Planning Study, the newly updated one, which came out 6-ish months ago, clearly says we have a dire shortage of homes. We need 78,000 homes built by 2027, and we're building homes at maybe about a third the rate we need to actually meet that figure. So my package is generally split up into legislation that would help finance affordable housing, legislation that would help finance infrastructure, legislation that would help finance the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, which is going to be a critical ally here in the fight to reduce housing prices, and then also bills that would just try and reduce the cost of construction, right? Which, when it's costing $600,000-ish per unit, without including profit or land, right? That's we got a big problem. So I've got about 20-ish bills, kind of at this scattershot all of the above approach. And Casey. So these are organized in no particular order. Number 1, conveyance tax reform. So this bill would turn the conveyance tax into a marginal rate structure. Right now, the conveyance tax is set up as a series of essentially cliffs, which as soon as you cross the threshold into the next tier, the tax is on the whole taxable value of your property. And so you can have major, financial repercussions on just a dollar increase in valuation. This creates a marginal tax structure similar to our income taxes work. You're only getting taxed a higher rate on the amount above the tier, so it really will smooth out the curve for conveyance taxes. It will also turn it into a per unit valuation. So, a 20-story or 20-unit walk-up apartment building currently would have a very high conveyance tax, even though each of those units has relatively low value. So this, it would take the total number of units divided by the value to come up with the rate. So essentially, this is intended to avoid penalizing multifamily units. And then it would have increase the conveyance tax for non-owner occupied housing, really above $2.5–3 million, those rates start to go up. Everything under $2 million would actually see a slight decrease for non-owner occupied and owner occupied. And then the higher you go on the non-owner occupied scale, the more conveyance tax you are paying. So then there'd end up being significant increases to the conveyance tax at over the $6 million threshold for non-owner occupied. And again, because we're taking multifamily out of there, it's really intended to be targeted at really high value, essentially single family homes or high value condos. There are some marginal increases to owner occupied rates also. It would raise about $70 million additional. And of that, the bill would allocate a significant portion to the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. So in the first couple of years, it'd be $50 million. And by year 5, it would climb to $60 million. And then they'd be capped at $60 million. It would also allocate significant amount of revenue to the Dwelling Unit Revolving Fund for the purposes of infrastructure in TOD districts. So about $30 million climbing to $40 million over 5 years. Next. This bill would take the Hawaii Housing Planning Study data. So Hawaii Housing Planning Study is updated every 5 years. It shows essentially demand figures for each county. And this would create a dashboard and just show essentially county's annual progress towards meeting those figures, right? So if the study is estimating that a county needs 14,000 units, the goal for each county, that county would be 14,000 units. And the counties would have to provide the data to show how many homes were built and how close they are to meeting that goal. It would include vacation rentals converting to owner occupancy. So it's not just newly constructed units. It's essentially trying to measure as well as we can occupied units. If a county is producing less than 50% of the housing estimated that the Hawaii Housing Planning Study estimates that it needs, it would create what's considered a builder's remedy. Basically, it would say that 201H projects that go through HHFDC, if HHFDC approves the 201H project, And again, if a county is producing less than 50% of the housing, which is not much housing, then a county would have no authority to reject the project unless there was a lack of infrastructure. So essentially, 218H projects that get approved by HHFTC go to the county, they have to approve it unless there's a lack of infrastructure. Similarly, it would sort of require that TOD projects at some minimum floor area ratios are also approved in a similar fashion. Next. This bill would require that the counties reduce their minimum lot sizes. So right now the counties all have very high minimum lot size requirements. Honolulu allows some 3,500 square foot lots, but most are 5,000 square feet and beyond. Neighbor islands are all in the 6,000 to 8,000 square foot minimum lot size range. It's important to note that this is like not the traditional development pattern in Hawaii. Right? Plantation camp era lots were very 1,500 square foot lots. Even plantation towns have non-conforming very small lots that helped sort of define the fabric of these communities with these small lots. Most municipalities around the country, inner ring suburbs, have 1,500 square foot, 2,000 square foot lots around that inner ring suburb. In Hawaii, since the 60s, essentially, we have just mandated very large lot developments. When most of the cost of a home is baked into the cost of that land, by requiring large lot sizes, we are increasing the cost of housing significantly. We're also reducing the buildable area by spreading homes further and further apart. So all this says is that counties would have to essentially couldn't require minimum lot sizes less than 1,200 square feet and would have to allow for 3-story units or less, right? So essentially you couldn't have a 2-story requirement. You'd have to allow for a 3-story building. Some other requirements just around trying to standardize setback, et cetera. Next. Maybe I should have organized it so all the county preemption bills weren't all stacked in the beginning. But this bill, last year in statute, in HB 1409, we defined transit supportive density. So we set some minimum standards in state law for what defines transit supportive density, basically like a minimum floor area, allowable floor area ratio of 7.0, which 7.0 translates, if you're covering your lot, that's a 7-story building. If you're only covering half your lot, theoretically, that's a 14-story building. But essentially just says the county says transportive density is defined as a FAR of 7 within a quarter mile of rail, an FAR of 6 outside of that within the county designated TODs. For neighbor island TODs, the FAR would have to be 4 and requires ministerial permitting, meaning a permit that goes through a planning department and isn't a discretionary permit within those floor area ratios. It didn't require that the counties do anything. It just says, here's our state definition of what transportive density is. It required its CDA when they're considering infrastructure upgrades to look at transit supportive densities. The idea is like make it as easy as possible to build lots of housing around rail, which I think we all want to do to ensure that rail works, that we have a vibrant connected city, that rail is financially viable, et cetera. And to be honest, there are lots of pretty low FAR requirements around rail stations right now, which make higher density development potentially unnecessarily prohibitive. So this just says that counties would have to comply with the definition that we came up last year. For a county designated TOD, they could always the counties get to determine their own TODs, so we're not forcing any of these things to upzone. You just, if you want to be considered TOD, then meet the standard. Next. Senator Chang came up with last year, 2 years ago maybe, an alternative pathway for 201H projects, which I think was a really valuable pathway. So as you all probably know, right, 201H 38 allows for projects that are 50% of the units are affordable, 50% or more are affordable. These projects can bypass essentially state and local zoning and building regulations and possibly get fee waivers. They have to still go through a multi-step approval process. With high interest rates, these projects are getting harder and harder to sort of make pencil. And also a problem here is that after 10 years, the affordability restrictions will end. You know, if they're a LIHTC project, they're going to go on for longer. But for a non-LIHTC project, the affordability restrictions can end after 10 years, and then those units can get sold to speculative buyers or whatever. This bill, kind of building off the work that Senator Chang has done in previous years, would just say that an alternative pathway for 201H would be that 80% of the units have to be deed restricted forever to ensure that those units are occupied by a local resident, basically. So they can be owner occupied or they can be long-term rented, but somebody's got to be in the unit forever. So the trade-off is they're not income restricted, but you're ensuring that there's no expiration essentially of these income restrictions and that for the life of the project, they will be deed restricted. Next. This bill, so currently counties all have what are known as inclusionary housing like mandates where they're going to require a certain set aside for affordable housing. So say if you're doing a 10-unit housing development, counties are going to require between 20 to 30% of those units are affordable. What has happened since the implementation of those requirements is that they have really essentially like stifled housing production. So if you have a 30% affordable set aside, that means that a developer is building units and having to rent or sell those units at below cost. And in order to recover those, they're shifting the cost into the market rate units. And by shifting those costs into the market rate units, essentially it makes development of many forms infeasible because you're shifting the market rate units to be too expensive, that the market can't bear it. And so, so it's really essentially like a tax on the market rate units to subsidize the affordable units. And there's pretty good data that like Kauai County's policy between 2008 until we changed it in 2021 produced 0 market rate units and 0 affordable units, right? So, and stifled housing construction. Similar data for City and County of Honolulu has had really limited production under their IZ requirements. What this does is it says that these mandates, and there's actually some Supreme Court precedents to say that these types of mandates should be considered as impact fees. It just says that they're considered an impact fee, that a county has to show a nexus to do a nexus analysis like you have to do for an impact fee, and that a county cannot, for most forms of development, just be shifting the cost into the market rate units, basically. So they got to do a study. They got to show that they are not just recovering the cost, requiring the developer to recover these costs by shifting costs into the market rate units. And essentially, then the counties will have to provide property tax rebates or fee waivers to ensure that they are providing the subsidy to ensure that these affordable units can get built. Importantly, it doesn't apply to like luxury housing, so it defines luxury in there. So if you're building, multi-million-dollar homes, you should, by all means, the developers can, shift these costs into those luxury rate units. It also doesn't apply to resort districts. If you're building units meant for transient use, by all means, you should be paying for affordable housing and they can shift the costs. What we don't want to happen is for sort of median housing, right, our missing middle housing, we don't want developers shifting the cost to those market rate units. Next. This bill will, so currently there's kind of a really big loophole in state and county law which doesn't know how to treat homes on wheels. So if you have a unit on wheels that's like self-contained where all the waste is held on site, counties don't know whether to call that a house or a car. And essentially a lot of people are putting these units up without any permits at all. Which I think the planning departments are often kind of encouraging because they're like, okay, if this thing's fully movable, put this wherever as long as we can force you to move it one day if somebody complains. They're doing though under the threat of like if somebody is living on that and your neighbor complains, that could be a zoning violation. So there's just a lot of like sort of a lack of clarity here. There's a lot of these types of units that are becoming easier and easier to build. So what this just says is that a county essentially has to process a zoning permit for these. They can count it towards a unit of density, right? So it's not saying if you've already maxed your density, the county isn't forced to sort of allow these things. But if you've got the allowable density, a county would have to process a zoning permit. But the counties couldn't process a building permit for these as long as they are HUD code certified, right? The federal HUD code has certification requirements for this type of housing. So if they're HUD code certified or they're self-certified under the International Building Code allows also for a self-certification process. Essentially, then you can bypass a building code requirement. Again, only if these things are movable, totally self-contained, and under 400 square feet. So this is a pretty fringe segment of the market, but I think it'll at least sort of create some clarity on what we're allowing. Next. This is a broader manufactured housing bill. Really just clarifies that the counties can't preempt any HUD code standards. That's already federal law. So there's federal HUD code, which is manufactured housing. which already preempts state and county law. This kind of just repeats some of that preemption language to very clearly clarify that counties couldn't really regulate or require extra requirements for these types of HUD code homes. And these HUD code homes are manufactured in a factory. You have to have a certifier in the factory to certify that they're built to the HUD code. And then the counties aren't going to come in with their own requirements after the fact. Really importantly, though, a major barrier to these forms of HUD code homes is that they can't be, they're not considered sort of real property for the purposes of a transfer. So it's hard to get financing, and I think selling a property can become complicated in how you're dealing with this home. So this just clarifies essentially that they're part of the property and they're considered real property, which will help for financing and selling. Next. This is kind of a mega bill, which does a number of things. It locks in the building code at the time of, if a county gives somebody like authorization to proceed with their building, even if they don't have their final building permit, essentially it locks in the code at that time. So a county couldn't give somebody authorization to proceed with construction and then 6 months later say, oh, the building code actually changed, now you're gonna have to change your footings. So it just says locks in the building code at that time. Turns our basically 3-year building code cycle into a 6-year building code cycle. The issue with the 3-year cycle is like everybody's just constantly getting caught up. As soon as kind of people understand the code, it changes again. This goes for like county inspectors. As a former council member, we were just constantly doing code updates. So this just spreads that out a bit. It also creates a single statewide building code. So instead of current process, State Building Code Council will approve a code, and then it'll go to the counties for another 18-month sort of approval process. And then the counties, as a former council member, I can say just like council members are not suited to like do the work of trying to figure out what the building code should be, and often also mediate between fights over the building code. You can have unions fighting over, they want different things, and it just becomes a very political conversation at a county level, and it shouldn't be. So this says single statewide building code upon adoption. So it gets rid of that 18-month second cycle for counties. But counties could still come after the fact and amend it if they want to. So for example, when I was on the Kauai County Council, we introduced and passed a bill to make it easier to do tiny homes. We just adopted an appendix of the IRC that wasn't adopted by the State Building Code Council. So that kind of thing would still be allowed, right? A county could come in. Big Island, maybe if they need some more flexibility around water catchment or something, they could come in with their own county amendments after the fact. Also, really importantly, it would consider triplexes and fourplexes under the International Residential Code instead of the International Building Code. So a number of states are doing this. Essentially, like the triplex and fourplex, right now, if you're doing a single-family home or a duplex, you're under the IRC. You don't need to put a sprinkler in those units. As soon as you go to 3 units, all of a sudden you fall under a commercial code. The same code that governs, a 450-foot tower. And it's pretty clear evidence that like the reason for considering triplexes and fourplexes under the commercial code for the last, decades was really to discourage their development. And they've been successful in that we have like no triplexes and fourplexes because they're cost prohibitive to build. So the same standards that govern a single family home or duplex, I think are good enough for a triplex or a fourplex. The fire code standards are, if you're reconverting an old home into a new home, you're going to have to come to current, building code standards, which are going to be much, much, much safer from a fire safety standpoint, even if it doesn't have the sprinkler system. Next. Sorry, I'm going to probably start running through these faster. We had this bill last year, created a deed restriction program, essentially would authorize HHFDC to give the counties money from the Dwelling Unit Revolving Fund for the counties to purchase deed restrictions on existing homes. The deed restrictions would have to ensure that that home is forever occupied by somebody who is living and working in Hawaii. So if a county wants to set up the program, they could have access to this funding through the Dwelling Unit Revolving Fund. Next. This would require that the counties allow catchment. We have, water is a big issue in Hawaii. Often there are water meter restrictions in different areas. So if somebody wants to build an ADU or an add-on to their home, they're going to be prohibited if there's a water meter restriction in that area. And except for Hawaii County, water departments are not allowing a catchment system if somebody has existing water on their property. And some of the concerns are on mixing, right? They don't want you to like mixing catchment with potable water. But I think we can work around those concerns, and this would be really important to ensure that people could, if they want to build a catchment system, but there's a meter restriction, I think let them do it. Next. This would create exemptions to parking mandates. So right now we have arbitrary parking mandates across the state for different forms of development. This can be really prohibitive for things like daycares or for small unit construction, for commercial space, for mixed use development. And again, these things are just sort of thought of and then put into code, and then everybody's got to abide by it. Minimum parking requirements have also really, if you look at all of our best communities in Hawaii, all of our like older plantation style towns were built pre-parking code, and they're nice and walkable and great because they are all entirely illegal and non-conforming, right? We have like made it illegal to build that type of development, and we forced everybody to build a strip mall, so that you have to have your buildings surrounded by a sea of parking. They can also add $50,000 to $65,000 per housing unit, $400 a month in rent in additional costs from parking. So we've really got to, this isn't saying don't put any parking. It's just saying for some forms of development, essentially let the developer do their own market analysis to determine how much parking is needed and let them right size the parking to that site. Sorry, one more thing that often happens is by having an arbitrary mandate in code, somebody could be designing a parking garage and their required stalls might be 4 more than that parking garage can handle. So they either have to put a whole nother floor to the garage, or get rid of units. And what they almost always do is just get rid of units, right? Like this isn't a good answer. Next. This would make the dwelling unit revolving fund equity program permanent. It currently has a sunset on it. Next. This would create a statewide housing data platform to monitor statewide housing and infrastructure development in each county. Really importantly, also, it would set up a model for analyzing land use across the state. We know, like intuitively, that if you are building very low density development far from a town, that development is going to be infrastructure intensive, and it's, fire protection and police protection is all gonna be very expensive because it's far away. And the property tax revenue is not gonna support the state and county services basically to this property. Whereas if you're building very high density development in a center of a town, it's gonna be the opposite, right? These are sort of net engines of property tax revenue and much more efficient from an infrastructure and services standpoint. But like, where's the gray area in there? Like, where do we transition from something that's fiscally productive to something that's fiscally not productive? We don't really know. So all this would do is sort of basically set up a methodology for analyzing zoning decisions based on fiscal productivity of land use to ensure that when we are building a development or zoning for development, that this thing is not going to be a net drain on resources and force us all to subsidize that form of development. Next. This would allow for HHFDC to transfer funds into the mixed income sub-account in the rental housing revolving fund. So really importantly, we created what was sort of previously known as Tier 2 funding within the rental housing revolving fund last year. The rental housing revolving fund traditionally has just funded LIHTC projects. And so most state and federal support then was just going for families making 60% AMI and below. The problem is most families in Hawaii are making more than 60% AMI, but they make too little to purchase a home in the open market. So what the mixed income sub-account, which was created last year, the intention is that we are funding homes between 60% AMI and 140% AMI. But HHFDC didn't have the ability to transfer funds into and out of that account. So we're just giving them that authority to get funds in there. Next. Right now, state law prohibits anybody from adding, even a bedroom or getting a building permit if you have an existing cesspool. I spend a significant component of my life in the ocean, and I am the biggest booster and supporter of ensuring that we are transitioning off of cesspools. But you do have a number of cesspools in the state which are located far from water resources. And essentially state funding and county funding is all going towards the high priority level 1 and 2 areas near the coast, and there's no real resources going to those that are far away from the ocean. Yet they still have the same prohibition on adding a unit. So if you're in a Malka area without impacting water quality, you can't get a building permit, and you're not getting any financial support to upgrade your septic. All this says is that essentially we would lift that prohibition for level priority 3 areas, which are the areas that are least likely to impact water quality, to allow somebody to add a bedroom up to 5 bedrooms, which is the same as you can do on a single septic. It clarifies if we allowed multiple dwelling units, it would be considered a gang cesspool and be prohibited by the EPA. So no extra dwelling units, but you could add extra bedrooms, whether attached or detached. Next. Currently, DOH rules for wastewater are outdated and, in my personal opinion, can be overly burdensome for some things. For example, each bedroom count in Hawaii, we estimate 200 gallons per day in wastewater flow for a bedroom. And that's twice as much as the nearest state measures for water flow, right? Nobody's using 200 gallons per day per bedroom. That's just an outrageous amount of water. But that determines the size of our, leach fields, et cetera, et cetera. So we are requiring often oversized systems because of this. We've also made it prohibitively hard to drop in a septic system into an existing cesspool or use that cesspool for water outfall, or for aerobic units, doing subsurface irrigation instead of a leach field. So there's a lot of things I think that could be updated within the wastewater rules to make it cheaper to convert, and to ensure that we can get off cesspools by 2050. So all this would do is essentially create a task force to look into the DOH rules, hire a consultant to help them amend those rules to make it cheaper to upgrade. Next. TIF, or this would authorize or housing infrastructure bonds. So the state constitution prohibits us from floating a bond based on future increases in tax revenue on that property. So all this would do is essentially put it on the ballot to authorize these types of housing infrastructure bonds, which would be you float a bond based on future increases of tax revenue that the development would create, right? So you're going to pay off the bond by the tax revenue that's created by the development that otherwise would never have come if you didn't get if you didn't float the bond to build it, which is hard to overstate how incredibly important this is. We're one of only 2 states, us and Arizona, that do not do tax financing or housing infrastructure bonds for infrastructure, which makes it just hard for us to finance infrastructure. And it's part of why when you look around Hawaii, we have decaying infrastructure all around and not a great way to pay for it. Next. This would clarify that individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities shall not be denied residency in foster care homes solely because of those disabilities. Next. This would increase the Hula May multifamily bond authorization from $3 billion to $5 billion. This is the private activity bonds that we're funding 4% LIHTC credits with. So without this authorization, we are going to run out of capacity to continue to issue those bonds. Next. This would, 2024, we passed a bill. So weirdly enough, state law didn't authorize counties to build or finance mixed-use development, so counties couldn't get bond funding to build out mixed-use development. And so in 2024, we clarified that counties have that authority, just like HGFTC has. But there was a sunset put on that, and my understanding is you can't float a bond if there's a sunset on that authority. So this just repeals the sunset. Again, very important for essentially building out the infrastructure in places like Iwilei and others that we need to do this heavy infrastructure investment for mixed-use development. Next. This, I'm pretty sure is my last bill on here, and this is my favorite bill. I will introduce this every year until I am no longer in the legislature, and I'm pretty sure it'll never pass. It was actually the very first bill that I drafted when I came to the legislature. So currently, it's a very small issue, but dear to my heart. If you are building a home through an owner-builder permit, or often these are conversions. So for example, I have a home, I converted an illegal dwelling unit to a legal dwelling unit. I subcontracted out the work for the plumbing and the electrician work to licensed contractors like you have to, and got an owner-builder permit for that. And then you have to sign an affidavit. Per state law, you have to sign an affidavit with the county saying that you will not rent the unit out for a year or sell it for a year. It's honestly I don't think there's any rationale to have that requirement in there. Everybody who signs it, not everybody, many people who sign that agreement are just breaking the law then and renting the unit out, or letting the thing sit empty for a year until they get past the year. Either way is just crazy outcome. This bill actually did pass 2 years ago and got vetoed. I've made it a little better. So hopefully, it's had about one bit of testimony on every hearing. So hopefully we can get it out there how important this would be for some people. Yeah, I think that's all I got. Is there any more? One more bill, which is not on here, which we just finished getting drafted. Last year we passed a self-certification program. Essentially, if a county takes more than 60 days to issue the permit, then an architect can self-certify that permit, essentially sign off that that this thing is in compliance, and the counties would have to issue the permit. And importantly, in that bill, the architect is indemnifying the state and the county when they're signing off on that. The indemnification language was probably overly broad and is going to prevent anybody from doing this. So we're just doing a tweak to that to essentially say that the architect is going to indemnify the counties for their own negligence, basically, right? So it's not going to cover everything, just the architect's negligence, which will ensure that the self-certification program can work. And that's all I got. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Rep. Evslin. Let's refrain from any questions till both presenters have gone. And on that note, I want to pass it off to the Honorable Senator Chang.
Thank you so much, Mako. Let me see if I can get this right. Okay, and there we go. First of all, thank you so much, Maka. Thank you so much, Chair Evslin. It's always a pleasure to work with you. You are the hardest working chair that I know, and I always appreciate sinking your teeth into all of these detailed issues. I also want to thank our staff. We have Casey here. You saw Ruben and earlier, and I think Zephanie has been in the office. They are the hardest working staff I know, and they have been revising my slides up until just a couple of minutes ago. So I really appreciate their hard work. And finally, I want to thank all of you for coming here today, both in person and online. I've been at this since 2018, but I know many, if not most of you, have been at this for far longer. And every year I learn new things and I learn new nuances that you are probably have been well aware of for many years now. And so that's kind of where I want to start my housing presentation with these two gentlemen. My father passed away in 2019, and he's the gentleman on the left. He was a University of Hawaii professor with one job, and my mother did not work. So with one state salary, he was able to buy a home in Waialaikahala, where I grew up, and to retire comfortably, put my brother and me through school, and have a great life. He moved to Hawaii back in the 1960s, and that was the era when an immigrant from China with nothing could do that in Hawaii. On the right-hand side, you might recognize the young Daniel Inouye, who went on to become a United States Senator. What they shared in common is that Daniel Inouye, when he was a first-time homebuyer, the first home that he bought was also in Waialaikahala. Then, as now, the most expensive district in the state. He was the grandchild of plantation laborers, and he was an officer in the United States Army. So how was it that people with extremely humble backgrounds were able to buy homes during this era? Well, I think it starts with this slide that many of you, if not most of you, have already seen before from the great Paul Brubaker, which shows the level of housing production since the 1920s all the way to the present day. And as you can see, there's a discontinuity here. Before the year 1972, I think you have on average about 9 homes being built per 1,000 residents. And then ever since then, you have an average of 3.5 homes being built per 1,000 residents. So clearly, the golden age of housing production was in this post-war era, the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. And for those of us who have spent time in the other 49 states, that probably mirrors the rest of the country as well. That post-war era was the era of abundance, of tons of housing production. And so one of the things that I always like to do is to actually look at successful examples and what made them successful, what actually caused this era of abundance. Here is, does anyone know who this gentleman is? Who's that? Henry J. Kaiser, an American industrialist, and here he is posing with some of the newly built homes in the subdivisions of Hawaii Kai. And speaking of Henry J. Kaiser, so he was a major developer, and he participated in this massive housing growth during the post-war era. As you can see, housing boomed more than doubled between 1940 and 1968, the number of housing units. The vacancy rate, however, remained extremely low. And more interestingly to me, the monthly rent did not go down, it did not stabilize, instead it went up dramatically. And so for the historians among us, the theory that just adding lots and lots of new supply would bring down rents has not proven to be the case. Indeed, all these years later, now fast forwarding all the way to the year 2025, there has not been a reduction of rents that has been welcomed by the community and brought lots and lots of people into home ownership and caused, an economically viable situation for people in the lower middle class and in the working class. So why did this boom happen? A lot of people, especially on the mainland right now, are saying, well, it's because that was the golden era of low regulation. And respectfully, I would actually strongly disagree with that. I think we can thank one person, and that is Uncle Sam. In 1929, the stock market crashes. 1933, President Roosevelt becomes president and launches the New Deal. And during this Great Depression era, well, even before the Great Depression, most people did not get mortgages in the United States. And those who could get a mortgage, you would have to put 50% down, and your entire term would be 5 years. So after 5 years, you'd have to either pay the whole balance or you'd have to refinance. So as a result, Roosevelt created Fannie Mae. And Fannie Mae did a couple of things. Number one, it created the 30-year mortgage with a 20% down payment that we're all familiar with today. That is the backbone of home ownership in Hawaii, in America and in Hawaii. And number two, it injected an enormous amount of capital into the mortgage market. So before, banks had to invest their own money when they were lending to home buyers. With the creation of Fannie Mae, because Fannie Mae would buy any conforming mortgages that banks issued, banks really became more middlemen. They would issue a mortgage and then they would turn around and sell it to Fannie Mae. So as a result, this unlimited amount of money begins pouring into the mortgage market, into the first-time homebuyer market, into the homebuyer market from Uncle Sam. Fast forward to May 1940, France is now about to fall to Nazi Germany. And Lindbergh has testified before the United States Senate that in the United States military, there were 38 non-obsolete warplanes. In the meantime, Germany was producing 19,000 state-of-the-art warplanes every single year. So that if the United States and Germany went to war, the United States would certainly lose because we simply did not have the armaments. And so belatedly, the United States decides to rearm. And this is the so-called arsenal of democracy. They first produced weapons not just for the United States, but primarily for our friendly nations, the USSR, France, Britain, China. Lend-Lease, this package, is actually even larger than the entire federal budget. So that's how much money starts flowing into armaments production. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is a Hoover-era agency, then finances 4,000 factories in 46 states. This is entirely federal. Most of these are known as GOCOs, government-owned, contractor-operated. Many of them are still in existence today. Boeing's Everett factory, where they produced the 737, was actually built by the Department of Defense back during this era. So they're building literally thousands of factories. This is the origin, by the way, of the Rust Belt. How did the Rust Belt get there? It did not get there primarily through private enterprise. It got there because Uncle Sam wanted to build thousands of factories, and he wanted to locate them outside of the major city centers where they would be vulnerable to bombing and attack. So this is really the golden age of rural heartland America. So in the meantime, Pearl Harbor now gets bombed. The draft is launched. 10 million primarily men are drafted, another 6 million volunteer. And with all the men now fighting overseas, they're being paid lots and lots of money compared to what they would have made in a Depression-era labor market on their family hog farm in Louisiana. They're also not paying rent. They're not paying for their uniforms. They're not paying for food. So Uncle Sam has grabbed them, sent them overseas to the beaches of Normandy, but in the meantime shoved thousands of dollars into their pockets that they would never have had under other circumstances. Now, since all the men are abroad, who's staffing these factories? Now, they're now being staffed in large part by women. And it's women from all strata of society, from the rich, the poor, the marginalized communities. Women who had not been in the labor force at all before this period are now in the labor force in large numbers. And again, they are making thousands and thousands of dollars a year where they would have made zero in years past. In the meantime, in June 1944, Congress passes the GI Bill. It creates the zero-down VA mortgage. It also gives education benefits, so it pays for, Senator Inouye's graduate school and law school. And now, when the war is over, you have all of these returning GIs marrying their wives. They now have thousands of dollars in their pocket that they would never have had without Uncle Sam literally grabbing them and shoving this money into their pocket. In the meantime, Uncle Sam has also started the interstate highway system. We were talking about infrastructure finance earlier. Uncle Sam paid for all this infrastructure, the transportation backbone of the growth of suburbia nationwide, because of defense purposes, because during the Cold War, Eisenhower wanted to be able to land planes on these long, straight stretches of highway across the country. So it's not that building material, and I should also mention that the 4,000 factories, many of them are now being directed towards civilian use, producing things like building materials that would power the growth of suburbia and the building boom in the post-war era. So it's not that, it's not that Danny Inouye or my father got, like a financial education in schools. It's not that modular construction techniques were used to bring down the cost of building materials. It's not that the salaries of construction workers went down because we broke up the labor unions. It's not that the developers were greatly subsidized directly by the federal government. It's that Uncle Sam gave thousands of dollars to grassroots rank and file Americans from every walk of life and made them so prosperous that they were then able to buy homes that were much, much more expensive than they had been 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. Another thing that the federal government does that I should mention is they keep interest rates low. The federal debt had quintupled as a result of the war. Federal Reserve was very aware of this and did not want to raise interest rates for fear of bankrupting the federal government. And as you see, when interest rates start spiking in the 1970s, that's also when housing production starts to decline nationwide, and I really don't think that that's a coincidence. Does anyone recognize this slide and this list of names? Anyone want to volunteer? Some of you can't see it. I see one person nodding.
This is from Land and Power.
This is from Land and Power in Hawaii. Has anyone here read Land and Power in Hawaii? Okay, so let us disabuse ourselves of any notion that the Hawaii land use environment was totally deregulated in this era. Quite the contrary. There was all kinds of regulation. So how did these home builders get around this regulation? An orgy of conflict of interest, of bribery, of self-dealing, of which this one page is just part of a long list. The $35,000 in a brown paper envelope was child's play back during this era, when developers and elected officials were engaged in a very mutually beneficial orgy of corruption. So I think we can all agree that this is a non-replicable event, and we certainly don't want to replicate this event. Now, the music did stop, and I'm old enough to know that, to remember the 1990s when the Japanese bubble burst, and real estate prices in Hawaii crashed. I remember down the block from us in Waialaikahala, there was a single-family home selling for $600,000, and I remember that because my aunt was considering buying it, and she passed on that deal, and that was the worst financial decision she ever made because that house has dramatically skyrocketed in value. Here, it even attracted the attention of the New York Times, writing in 1998 that there was even as late as 1998, there was still no evidence that the market has established a bottom. The Hawaii housing market was in free fall. So this is the private sector in action. This is the boom-bust business cycle in action. And did the Hawaii public welcome these crashing real estate prices? Did they say, this is great, all these first-time home buyers are now going to be able to afford homes, we are now going to lift millions, hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty? No, quite the opposite. Again, I am old enough to remember, this is the era when the working class of Hawaii was hollowed out because they left Hawaii. They did not see the 1990s as a golden age of low home prices that they could now enter the market. They left because there were better business and job opportunities in places like Las Vegas. So let us not pretend, let us disabuse ourselves of any notion that even if we were to successfully induce a private sector housing construction boom and watch prices skyrocket, that the succeeding bust would then be a welcome thing for the people of Hawaii. Quite the opposite. Politically, it also led to the first Republican governor in decades being elected here in Hawaii, and both the House and the Senate nearly getting Republican majorities because the voters of Hawaii were so dissatisfied with the dire economic conditions of Hawaii brought about by the private sector housing bust. Okay, so that's kind of an overview that I've developed of what it means to have unfettered private sector housing growth through the lens of Hawaii. As some of you will know because you attended this delegation, I also organized and went to Arlington and Fairfax County and Virginia and Montgomery County, Maryland, as well as Vancouver, British Columbia this past August to see two housing booms in action today. I think we can all agree that the Vancouver area and the DC area are two of the most vibrant private sector housing markets today. Now, how did they stimulate so much housing construction? This is a diagram from the general plan of Arlington County, Virginia. And as you can see from the color coding, they had a choice back in the 1960s. Do we do gentle density? Do we allow triplexes and fourplexes on single family lots throughout our county? Or do we do sledgehammer density? Do we identify a very narrow, geographically small corridor of failing strip malls and upzone that small corridor to sky-high density around the metro system and leave everything else fossilized in amber? And that's exactly what they chose. And that is the housing model that we have in Arlington County today. We have very, very high density on a very narrow, you see that red strip around some of the arterial roads where the metro stations are, but everything else remains very, very low density. And because of that social compact, they let the single family homes as they were. The single family homes were like, those residents were okay with a sledgehammer density on this very narrow set of parcels of formerly commercial land near the transit systems. And I think that's empirically what happened there to great success. Vancouver is the same thing. This is one of the new developments that's coming up in Vancouver. And again, you can see how high density these towers are and how quickly the density drops to single family homes within just a short block away. So again, we see two real-life examples of sledgehammer density producing a lot of housing production as opposed to so-called gentle density. Another thing that I really saw in action, this is a slide from Vancouver. And on the day that we went to Richmond, BC, a suburb of Vancouver, we met with Richmond city officials. And I remember several years ago when I was transiting through Vancouver and stopped in Richmond, I remember the real estate signs were all in Chinese. The advertisements were entirely in Chinese. There was not one word of English. And while there is now English on the signs in Richmond, I asked the Richmond city officials, so it seems pretty clear that your median buyer is going to be an overseas investor from Asia, right? And they were like, no. These are local people buying our homes. Just a few minutes later, or maybe a couple of hours later, we went to lunch at a food court in Richmond. It was not this one, but it was one like this one. And I thought, okay, it's Chinese food. Our delegation from Hawaii should be able to order. Well, the food was so authentic that I think our delegation had a lot of trouble even recognizing what the menu items were. Out of the entire food court, aside from our delegation, some of whom are here today, there was one non-Chinese person, and he was the cash register repairman. It was extremely clear to me that the housing growth in Vancouver was fueled by this external growth, primarily these Asian investors, in this case from China. In Arlington, Virginia, Fairfax County, Virginia, the median home buyer there is not some graduate of high school from Arlington. It is a very well-paid federal contractor. It is a well-paid federal professional employee. These are outsiders that are powering those housing booms. And indeed, in Hawaii, during our housing boom, it was very similar. Our housing growth was twice the national average, and most of that difference can be explained by the enormous amount of in-migration from the mainland. About 40% of our population growth was from the mainland, or some of it was from overseas. Now, this was the era when my father moved to Hawaii from California immediately, but from Hong Kong and, from mainland China originally. And this was an era when a lot of people in Hawaii moved here. Now, I think that's a great thing. I'm personally very grateful to the people of Hawaii for having accepted my father and our family as we grew up. But I have never heard anyone in Hawaii say what we really need to do is to build tons and tons of housing so we can welcome an explosion of in-migration from the other 49 states and from overseas. I think we have to clearly understand that the private sector housing market that is obligated to sell to the highest bidder cannot play the role of primarily housing our local people. And that's why the state and the public sector needs to step up in a big way, because the state and the public sector can restrict any units that are being sold or rented to local people exclusively. All right, does anyone know who these two gentlemen are? Representative Evelyn. Governor Newsom and Ezra Klein of California. Governor Newsom is trying to become president of the United States. Ezra Klein is an extremely influential author and pundit, and he's recently written a book called Abundance that I'm sure some of you have read. And there's this idea that people like these people have promulgated, that Democrats can't build. And I just want to, I think that's extremely lazy and ideologically driven thinking. Because we visited Fairfax County, Virginia, and this was 4 p.m. It was August in Virginia. We had just been on 2 or 3 hours of walking tours of Tysons and Arlington County. I was exhausted. I'm sure many of my fellow delegation members were. And then we arrived in Tysons. And in Tysons, some individuals from the government and from some private agencies started their presentation. I sat myself all the way in the back corner there because I thought I was going to pass out from the heat in this nice air-conditioned room. And then they started saying things like, we have a plan to increase our population from 20,000 people to 120,000 people. This is Fairfax County, Virginia. It's one of the most prosperous coastal counties in the United States. It has one of the most expensive housing markets in the United States. It's one of the bluest counties in the United States. I had heard from all these smart people that Democrats can't build. What is going on? This was like a Soviet 5-year plan that I was now hearing about in Tysons. And here is a diagram. This is a 2020 diagram of several of their major development projects that were approved. Now, there were some interesting, political circumstances. A lot of the single-family homeowners, like we saw in Arlington, their property taxes were going to go up to maintain their aging infrastructure. So what they decided to do was, okay, we'll leave our single-family communities intact, and instead, we'll take one small corner of our county, this formerly known as Tysons Corner, now just Tysons, and we are going to develop the heck out of it. We're going to densify the heck out of it. It's one small corner. It's bounded by highways. It's unlikely that this development is going to spill over into our pristine single-family neighborhoods, and that has succeeded. And Tysons is now growing by leaps and bounds, and they're proactively going out there, and the county's proactively building fire stations and schools in order to attract the residents that will pay the property taxes to limit the impact to the single-family homeowners. And so I think we need to, it astounds me how intellectually lazy some of these people are, because Fairfax County, Virginia is within the metro area of Washington, D.C., where they all live. And they should just take a short metro ride to see what works. And I would, say to the folks who are committed to the private sector, both here and on the mainland, how can we emulate models like that one? But all this growth, even in the DC suburbs and in the Vancouver suburbs, has not resulted in lower prices. These are the prices in Arlington County, Virginia. As you can see, goes skyrockets. Arlington is only marginally cheaper now than New York City. It's one of the most expensive housing markets in the United States, and my local friends were like, why on earth would you study our housing markets? These are some of the most expensive counties in the country, and they were right. This is Vancouver. Housing markets have skyrocketed in Vancouver, even though they've built more housing in Metro Vancouver than perhaps any city in North America as a percentage of their population. As you can see here, Vancouver is now the 3rd most expensive housing market in the entire world. It's just one notch ahead of Hawaii, even though it has built a ton of infill housing. So we need to understand that private housing booms do not reduce prices. In fact, they accelerate prices. And in fact, the places in Hawaii that did not experience housing booms, like Molokai, do not have expensive housing even to this day, right? So even in Hawaii, there are places that are still rather affordable to live in. And I think we need to understand why that might be the case. Okay, so this is former Housing Minister of British Columbia, Ravi Kahlon. And he's standing in front of a lectern discussing the BC Builds program. Okay, and so for those of us in the real estate sector, there's this quote that a lot of people repeat: "Make no little plans, they have no magic to stir men's blood." And that was from the architect of Central Park. BC Builds, launched in February 2024, is a $5.5 billion Canadian dollar program, $4 billion US dollar program to provide low-cost financing for housing projects that are below market. For most of these projects, just 20% of the units are going to be roughly 20% below market. But 80% of the projects are going to be as much as the market can bear, i.e. market prices. They're combining the cheap financing, the relatively low restriction on the incomes of the units, with a so-called rocket fuel process, where they're convening regulators, landowners, developers, financiers, governments in small committees from day one to rocket fuel the development process from roughly 3 to 5 years to just 12 to 18 months. With the $5.5 billion Canadian dollars, they are bringing all kinds of people out of the woodwork. In just 1 year, they've had 38 applications, and they have 30 to 35 projects that are now in various stages of pre-development. When we went there in Vancouver, they hadn't had any shovels on the ground yet, but they were getting there. If you transfer funds into a sub-account with $10 million, you might get a project here and there. But if you transfer $1 billion into that fund, suddenly landowners across the state are going to be like, maybe I can get a piece of that action. And that's exactly what we have here in BC that's happening. It's been so successful in BC that across Canada, Prime Minister Carney has announced Build Canada Homes, a $25 billion Canadian dollar investment project modeled on BC Builds to take this model nationwide. So I would urge those of us with the power to do so, make no small plans. 10 million, great start, but maybe $1 billion. That would have the magic to stir men's blood. All right, I think this is a gentleman who needs no introduction. The Premier of the province of British Columbia is a gentleman named David Eby. And David Eby is the former housing minister of British Columbia. So he has a lot of personal information and knowledge and expertise about the housing sector. And like I said, about a year and a half ago, or about 2 years ago now, he launched the centerpiece, the crown jewel of his housing plan, BC Builds. But that was not the first thing he did. Before that, he did a lot of other things. The nation of Canada actually banned foreigners from buying residential property. The province of British Columbia slapped a 20% conveyance tax on foreign purchasers. They gave record amounts of funding for homelessness, $80 million in 2023 and a further $90 million in 2025, which dwarfed all previous appropriations, which, by the way, they badly need. We drove through the east end of Vancouver multiple times, and the homelessness situation there is extremely dire. They created a rental protection fund to help nonprofits. I know many of you folks are in the nonprofit sector, to help them buy rental housing and to keep it affordable. And they also did an all-you-can-eat buffet of all those libertarian, YIMBY abundance reforms. They eliminated single-family zoning, they did single-stair construction, they eliminated public hearings, they increased density for TOD areas, they also eliminated TOD parking minimums. They fed everybody. Everybody was full. And then BC Builds rolls out to build thousands and thousands of units province-wide. So I think one of the lessons that I've really taken from here is, in order to create the political conditions to actually solve the problem, to do the top-down financing, the low-cost financing that it would actually take to solve the problem, you got to feed everybody first. And so that's what this slide represents. I'll just do one final note on some really interesting perspectives I learned. which is from the indigenous community. So when I visited Victoria, BC a few years ago, I visited the Royal BC Museum. They have, among other things, the dagger that killed Captain Cook, or one of them, because the Bishop Museum has another. Maybe they both did. But one thing that I saw that I never thought I would, I just completely blew my mind, was not that dagger. It was like a multi-volume, leather-bound, like encyclopedia. That was a modern-day treaty from like 1998 or something between I guess it was either the government of Canada or the province of British Columbia and one of their First Nations. And it just did not occur to me in Hawaii growing up that a government and a First Nation could actually negotiate a treaty together and actually work together in a productive way to build wealth and to build a community hand in hand. And this, so I've shown you a bunch of slides already. This is the biggest one out of them all. It's called the Jericho Lands Development. This is being spearheaded by 3 different First Nations, including the Squamish Nation that we met with. Their Squamish Nation, by the way, is building a 6,000 unit market rate development called Sanak. That's for everybody to generate revenue for their tribe. It's kind of like Kaka'ako Makai, or at least the previous iteration of Kaka'ako Makai in action. Now they're partnering with 2 other First Nations to develop this Jericho project, where they're going to build a ton of high-density housing, again at market rates, to generate revenue for their nations. And again, you can see how steep the drop-off is from these 50, 60-story skyscrapers to single-family homes just across the street. But this model has been extraordinarily profitable. And these nations, many of them, including Squamish and Musqueam, are some of the wealthiest organizations in BC. Squamish is able to pay for all of the higher education of all of their members. When they were building Sanak, at one point in the construction, over half of all the workers, including construction workers, but also including architects and other professionals, over half of them were members of the Squamish Nation. And of course, they've integrated a ton of cultural, into the design, into the development of this project. And it was just so inspiring to see them harness the power of private sector profit-making development to deliver gifts, as Mitt Romney might put it, to their members. And I think that we can do that here in Hawaii, not only for our indigenous people, but also for the state as a whole, to benefit the entire state. All right, so I think I've been pretty clear that the post-war boom-bust model was really not a model, nor a model that any sane policymaker would want to replicate. That the disease was worse than the cure, or the cure, rather, was worse than the disease. I think what we can do is this. I think we can, in a fully mature market where my ideas are adopted, if I had a magic wand, we would have a robust private sector market continuing to produce high-end housing for those who can afford it. And then we would have a state and county public sector market that would be producing housing at large scale, at cost, revenue neutral, not deeply subsidized, income blind for all the people of Hawaii, kind of like Costco gas. Okay? Costco gas is not free. It is not close to free. It's not even that much cheaper than Shell or Chevron or 76. It's maybe 10 to 20% cheaper. But I'm one of those people who lines up because that 10 to 20% makes a difference in our family being able to make ends meet. And I know thousands of people across Hawaii also make the same conclusion. And I don't think we can deliver a $200,000, a $700,000 two-bedroom unit for $1,500 a month like our LIHTC program does. I don't think that's a large-scale, scalable, sustainable model. But I think we can deliver that unit, that $700,000 unit, for $700,000. And I think that there are a lot of people in our community who could buy for $700,000 with parental help, especially if interest rates go down, if we step in and provide assistance with the down payment, with lower interest rate loans, and so on. So if that state and county level are able to produce lots and lots of housing, that's maybe 10 to 20% cheaper than the private market, I think that will achieve abundance, psychological abundance, because abundance is a psychological state. If we are able to offer that good deal, Costco buyers, right, have a good deal. They know that they're getting something cheaper than the private market. If we, than the other gas chains, if we are able to offer the local people of Hawaii, the owner occupants of Hawaii, a deal, you get a little bit cheaper but in this case, hundreds of thousands of dollars or $100,000 or $200,000 cheaper than everybody else, then they will feel like they will have a good deal. And that will be true abundance. All right, so this is a recycled slide. I think this is where the low-hanging fruit is. You've heard me, go on offense against the Rental Housing Revolving Fund now for many years. You might have heard the press coverage of one of my colleagues in the state Senate yesterday, adopting a lot of those talking points. I want to reiterate that this is that in the years that I've been talking about the Rental Housing Revolving Fund, things have gotten even worse. So as you can see, it used to cost 200,000 taxpayer dollars per unit. It now costs $378,232 of state taxpayer subsidy per unit. I think we can all agree that this is not a fiscally sustainable solution, long-term, large-scale solution for the state. And yet they keep getting more money. The governor in his budget last year included $250 million. I think the legislature ended up putting in $100 million. But that's a lot of money. We cannot keep doing this. We cannot keep giving out free money to for-profit private developers. I've shown you this slide before as well. You can't see it, but in the very bottom right-hand corner, you have the cash balance, 2025 in the Rental Housing Revolving Fund. The cash balance sitting in cash in this fund, $587 million. Okay, and yet we in the legislature put in another $100 million last year. Without a single additional dollar into this fund, it will not zero out until the year 2038. Okay, this is indefensible. We have to do something. I should also point out, by the way, that this fund has grown so large, it has crowded out all the private sector financiers. It is now producing over half of all the housing construction being built in the state of Hawaii. All the private sector developers have been drawn like moths to a flame to this incredibly good deal. In the meantime, we are saturating this market. In Oregon, they've already saturated this market. They have 1,900 vacant LIHTC units. In Hawaii, we have a lot of vacant LIHTC units as well. I want to show you this. This is the HHFDC Hawaii Housing Planning Study, table 39, one of my favorite tables. You should look this up, download this online. Okay, so this estimates, HHFDC's own estimates for housing demand at every level of AMI, from less than 30%, 30 to 50%, say 50 to 60, all the way up to 180 plus. And then for ownership, and for rental, for single family, for multifamily, it breaks those all out. If you look in the bottom, column 3, the last row, you have rental units, multifamily, 50 to 60% AMI. That is LIHTC. LIHTC builds, out of all of these different cells, LIHTC builds that one cell. And that one cell is 827 units over a 5-year period. That is 100-something units per year. Remember this slide? We are building 2,000 units of that one cell per year. We are overbuilding this one cell by a factor of 13. And we are underbuilding virtually every other one of those cells. We have to get our eggs exclusively out of that one basket. We need to put the eggs into the other baskets. All right, so cheap financing. I know that people's eyes glaze over every time I talk about housing financing. I'm a lawyer, my eyes would glaze over every time too. I am trying to make it easy for people to understand. I know this has some complicated equations on it, but I'm just going to direct you to 4 numbers. On the far left, 41 cents per square foot. On the right, in the same box, in the other box, 81 cents per square foot. That's the amount of rent you can charge. So the left-hand red box is a 50% off discount from the black box on the right. Why? Let me direct you to 2 further numbers. In that red rectangle, you have on the upper right corner of that red rectangle, 2.5. Okay, that's the interest rate on the loan, 2.5%. In the black box, you have another red number in the far upper right. That is 5.0. That's 5%. If you drop the cost of financing by half, you can lower the rent by half. That's what this slide is intended to show. And this is from the city of Vienna, which produces housing in this manner. If we, the state, are able to offer low-cost financing for housing construction, we can produce significantly cheaper housing for the people of Hawaii. Everything else can stay the same. All the regulations, all the labor unions, all the global prices for lumber and steel and cement, all of that can stay the same. But if we do this one weird trick, we can dramatically bring down the cost of housing. All right, this is just another slide. The middle two columns are not that important. This is a listing of all of HHFTC's existing housing finance programs. I've highlighted in big numbers so those of us lawyers can see clearly, $378,000 per unit. Out of all their housing financing programs, this is by far the most expensive. And tier two right below it, tier two, which is to the 120% AMI level, is $354,000 per unit, not that much cheaper. These are the two most expensive tools in the toolbox. These are, the platinum Cadillac plan of housing production. If we just put our eggs into some of those other baskets, we will be able to deliver housing at much cheaper per unit cost, 30-something thousand, literally 1/10 the cost of these of this existing model. All right, so this is the rental housing. So these are some of the bills, and I'm going to try to be as efficient as I can because we don't have that much time. We want to, as Representative Evslin mentioned, we want to transfer funds out of the main rental housing revolving fund into the sub-account without legislative authorization. That got all the way to conference last year. Hopefully we'll take it all the way this year. We also want to take existing LIHTC financing to the extent that we're going to fund existing LIHTC financing. The most indefensible feature of our existing LIHTC financing model is that it is temporarily affordable, and that many of these private for-profit developers, when the affordability period expires, are completely free to raise rents to market, to kick out all the existing low-income tenants, and then sell the building on the private market as a completely, fully market rate apartment building. That is a scandal because that developer didn't put in any of the money. The federal and state taxpayer put in 2/3 of the money. The tenants put in the rest. And the developer gets this huge amount of profit. We cannot, that's actually not what happens in real life. What usually happens in real life, for many of you, as familiar to many of you in the room, is the tenants freak out as that affordability period expires. They petition the legislature to buy them out and to preserve the affordability. And soft-hearted legislators like Chair Evslin can't say no. And the state ends up paying twice for that same project. Completely insane. So that $378,000 times 2 is what we are paying as a state, and it's just ridiculous. So I will die on this hill that it has to be perpetual. If we are going to give out LIHTC and rental housing revolving funding, it has to be perpetually affordable. All right, so revenue neutral housing. This is my big idea. So we have some amendments to the 99-year leasehold HCDA program, also known as Aloha Homes, that we passed last year to broaden the buyer pool. One of the things that they want is they want the buyers to be able to own other real property. I am not extremely thrilled about this idea because I think the point is to have owner occupants who are not landlords. But we'll let them, I guess, make their case and have their day in court. We want to extend, both make the DERF equity program permanent, but also to invest in a slightly different way to make the equity that the state invests an upfront equity investment, which would accelerate the payment to the developer, which would accelerate the development process, but it would also give the state a direct financial stake. So if the building makes money, the state makes money in a much more direct way. And then finally on this slide, I'll skip the third one, but the final one is to allocate the conveyance tax to the DERF. And also to increase the amount of conveyance tax being deposited into the rental housing revolving fund. I also want to streamline state housing projects. If the state is doing it, I think we can all agree that it's a state priority and it should not get bogged down in the same regulatory thicket that Representative Evslin has so eloquently described. And so we have a bunch of ideas. I know our county folks are working very hard to streamline the permitting process. Unfortunately, there's still a long way to go. And so we have 3 different ideas here. Either the state is entirely exempted from it, or the state could directly fund positions in the county DPPs to work exclusively on state projects. And then finally, to remove the county council approval requirements for state-financed housing developments. We'll see, you know, I mean, the state has been historically reluctant to do so because the counties don't take dedication of infrastructure. That doesn't go through the permitting process, but we'll see what happens. I also want to give further institutional weight to housing. Oh, this is the Office of the State Architect would be an in-house state permitting agency for state projects. I want to create an affordable housing inventory land task force to identify specific parcels for housing. We also have several additional measures here. The first two here would rename existing agencies to the Department of Housing. With all due respect to the directors of the DBED, I don't think historically it's been a requirement of the DBED director to have any expertise on housing. In fact, I can't think of a DBED director in my time who did, you know, have previous experience in housing. And I think by renaming it DBED, D-Head, I think that would, you know, give everybody notice that this person should probably have some expertise in housing, and same for a new Department of Housing. I also don't like the governance of HHFDC. To be quite blunt, I think HHFDC has failed. I think HHFDC, which is a Hawaii Housing Finance and Development Corporation, has done a very poor job of developing. It's done a probably even worse job of financing, as I've already described. And I think part of it is that due to the indirect nature of the board and the executive director appointment, it's not really politically accountable. The board selects the executive director, and the board chair is legally prohibited from being a gubernatorial director member. If a gubernatorial member were able to be the chair of HHFDC, then at least we would have that level of accountability where the governor would be kind of directly responsible for what's happening at this agency. Instead, the agency is able to award these LIHTC and rental housing revolving funds, you know, without anyone watching. No one in the legislature is watching. I mean, you know, I'm pretty sure that 75 legislators do not read the minutes of the HHFDC board meetings. Nor is I would be surprised if anyone in the executive branch is reading the minutes of these meetings, and we need to bring this board into harmony with the rest of the priorities of the executive branch. One way to do it would be to have that board chair be an appointee of the governor. We could also have. I also want the directors of both HHFDC and HPHA to be on each other's boards. DHHL has advocated for being on the board of HHFDC as well, which I agree with. Let's see. I'll go through some of these additional measures here. SB 2194 here, I also want to highlight, as I already mentioned, private for-profit corporations are now getting a lot of these rental housing revolving fund and LIHTC loans, and I think that's wrong. And so SB 2194 would require that these organizations be either government agencies that have no profit motive or organizations that are required to use all their profits to develop additional housing. This is what Vienna does. So they are for-profit organizations, but they cannot take that money and buy yachts, or like the Clarence Ching Foundation has done, to take their profits and to donate it to schools and hospitals. As you know, as nice as that might be, the money originated in housing, and it's from the taxpayer. It should go back into housing. And so here's four of my, I guess, key takeaways here. We need to use the rental housing revolving fund more efficiently. We need to prioritize revenue neutral projects because those can scale. We need to reduce procedural delays for state-led housing projects. And we need to increase the institutional weight of housing in government. Every politician says that housing is the #1 priority, but you know, there's not even a cabinet member today with housing in their title. And I think we need to change that. So those are some of the key takeaways. I will just briefly go and, sorry, I'm going to need to reload because I think some changes were made here. And let me just kind of quickly run through these guys too. So all right, so the first couple are some HHFDC bills. Here are a couple of the renaming bills. Oh yeah, here are the bills that add the directors of HPHA and HHFDC to each other's boards. We have a tiny home pilot project. And Yeah, there we go. So on that note, thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you, Senator. We'd like to open up the room now for any questions. I, of course, advise that we keep it civil. We'll start with in-person attendees and we'll shift over to the Zoom questions. Zoom attendees, please type your questions into the Q&A. And yeah, we'll start taking questions.
Thank you. And Kevin, you've been such a powerhouse of housing development at the city. I think it's visionary what you've done in terms of taking a leadership role in directly developing city parcels, acquiring them, buying them, transferring them over from the state. I think you've seen that both of us have are champions of your ideas to allow further mixed-use housing. And I also want to commend you in a decision that was not popular, frankly, here at the state, to take back your bond cap so that you would have a little bit more direct control and oversight and accountability in assigning where those LIHTC and rental housing revolving funds are going. Because as you can clearly see at the state level, the HHFDC has not been, has been like a comet shooting out of the solar system instead of, within the gravitational orbit of the accountable branches of government.
And we'll take a few more just because we're kind of running at the boundaries of our time limit. So any other questions? And of course, you can always direct questions to our office. Many of you may know our email by now. It's posted online. That'll be repevzin@hawaii.gov. And then you guys as well? Senator Cheng at hawaii.gov. So.
I just had a question for Housing Chair. You mentioned the minimum parking size bill to allow the reduction in parking spots for some of the units, and I just want to say I really do think that's a good idea, especially in the downtown area here from Ala Moana up to Waikiki. There's so much transit within half a mile. There's so much groceries and so everything we need within a half mile area. So I just want to say I really do support that. I hope you can have like no parking for some of these units because frankly that will reduce the cost base so much. So I just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I will say that that is not typically the feedback we get on bills that relate to parking. Any compliments anybody wants to give me relating to parking, I'm happy to do that because I'm going to get pilloried pretty soon on it. So.
Just for the questions from the audience, and I think in order for the Zoom attendees to hear you, you're going to have to speak into one of these mics, so you'll have to come up here. And I will just say, I don't like parking requirements either. I used to represent Waikiki, where I learned that the parking standard in Waikiki is one parking stall for every 4 hotel rooms. So clearly, most of those tourists don't have cars. That being said, just a couple minutes walk away from this building is a LIHTC senior project that can't find tenants. One of the reasons that's cited is that it doesn't have parking. And it is in the heart of downtown, in the heart of that extremely rich public transportation that we're talking about. So I think we have to be realistic about the reality that there will be demand for parking for a long time to come in this state.
We'd like to address one of the questions that was just answered. So much priorities focus on supply and demand. Is there interest in bills about renter protections or those that give right of return to renters in projects that are redeveloped to make sure every new unit built gives the first right to a local family who was displaced? Opening to any elected official.
I'll take that briefly. Yeah, I mean, I have 2 bills relating to ensuring that those homes are occupied by local families. We have the Kama'aina Homes Bill, which can purchase deed restrictions, and the 201H reform, which would ensure that units are deed restricted in perpetuity. As far as ensuring sort of right of, a displaced individual to have the first right for a unit, I think that's something that we could consider for state-financed projects. We couldn't put a blanket mandate on market rate housing for that type of restriction. And just a note on tenant protection. I do support, expanded tenant protections where necessary. Representative Nettie has been a champion for some of these reforms, and she has some good bills coming out along those lines. But I will say, I have a rental unit in my own home. I converted, an illegal unit into a rental unit. When I put that thing on Craigslist, I got 90 applicants for that unit within a 3-day period on Kauai. We're in the heart of Lihue. And about half of those just had amazing cover letters, and I could have just closed my eyes and probably chosen any tenant and had a incredible tenant. And also cover letters of total desperation, please help me, I need to find a home, I can't find anything. And part of the reason that tenants are in such a precarious place right now is that there's no rental inventory available, right? If you look in Lilly, the reason I got 90 applicants is because on Craigslist, I was the only rental unit at that moment. And so part of the way that we can ensure that tenants have more power in the market is to ensure that there's more rental inventory available. So it's part of why I've been such a big booster of ADUs and of increasing rental stock statewide. And I was a renter for a long time on Oahu, right? And every time we rented a home, we stuffed a whole bunch of guys in that home to make it work. I had people living in my closet. We had people living in my garage. I had my realtor landlord call one day and say, a neighbor complained that there's a guy living in your garage. And I had to be like, because there is a guy living in the garage. And that's really, problematic. So anyway, I really support doing anything we can to increase rental inventory. And part of the benefit of that is that you increase tenant power when you increase rental inventory. We should have landlords fighting over tenants instead of the other way around.
I just have a couple of comments to that. I think, HPHA has been doing a lot of redevelopment, and they have the gold standard of renter protections in place. No bill that's going to pass the legislature is going to give greater protections to renters and HPHA tenants. And that process, has not gone 100% smoothly. Even though they've been required to, and they have, complied with those requirements, there's still a lot of problems with any time you displace somebody. I don't know that now is politically the time. I don't see the votes there in the House and the Senate to pass these types of protections. That being said, I do think that they work. A lot of the libertarians in this country talk about this great success of Japan and building tons and tons of housing stock in Japan and rents being low in Japan. Well, Japan has incredible rent control and renter protection provisions. So clearly those provisions have not stymied the growth of rental housing and housing in general in Japan. So I think it on an economics level is not impossible to make work, but I don't think politically that the votes are there.
Okay, once again, thank you for both individuals for presenting. I think that was a very informative event. Yeah, thank you guys, and thank you all for attending and taking interest in this issue. So,
And thank you, Malka. Great job.
Thank you, Malka.